June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. 0730 hours. The morning tide pulls back across the blood-darkened sand, revealing a shoreline transformed into an industrial beachhead in the span of mere hours. Sergeant Klaus Weber, the German 352nd Infantry Division, crouches in a concrete bunker overlooking what the Americans call Omaha Beach, his hands still trembling from the morning's ferocious combat. Through the smoke and the dust and the acrid smell of cordite that hangs in the air like a shroud, he watches something that makes no tactical sense, something that violates every principle of warfare he has learned in 5 years of military service. The Americans are not retreating. Despite the withering fire his division has poured into them since dawn, despite the hundreds of bodies floating in the surf and sprawled across the obstacles, despite losses that would have broken any Wehrmacht unit he has ever seen, the Americans continue to land. But it is not merely the infantry that troubles Weber as he peers to the firing slit of his position. It is everything else. Trucks are rolling off landing craft onto the beach even as machine gun fire still chatters from the bluffs. Bulldozers, massive yellow machines he has only seen in peacetime construction, are already clearing obstacles and pushing debris aside to create paths inland. Crates and boxes and equipment are being stacked on the sand in growing pyramids, organized with precision that seems impossible amid the chaos of combat. Medical teams are establishing aid stations within sight of German positions. Engineers are marking mines and cutting wire and assembling pontoon causeways that extend from the landing craft to the beach. Weber has fought on the Eastern Front, has witnessed the titanic battles around Stalingrad and Kursk, has seen entire Soviet armies shattered and reformed and shattered again. But he has never seen anything like this. This relentless mechanical certainty, this absolute conviction that the beach will be held because the resources being poured onto it are simply too vast to be denied. In that moment, watching the Americans transform a contested killing ground into a functioning port facility while bullets still fly, Klaus Weber understands with terrible clarity that Germany has not merely lost a battle. Germany has encountered an enemy whose approach to warfare is fundamentally different, whose strength lies not in the fighting spirit of individual soldiers, but in the sheer overwhelming mass of material they can bring to bear. And in the weeks to come, that realization will be proven correct in ways that will shatter German defensive doctrine and break the Wehrmacht's capacity to resist. What do you think Weber saw in those first chaotic hours that made him realize the true nature of American military power? Was it the courage of individual soldiers, or something far more devastating to German hopes? The arrival of an industrial system that could not be stopped? The story of how American logistics overwhelmed Germany in the summer of 1944 begins not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the factories and shipyards and training facilities of the United States, in the careful planning of staff officers who understood that modern warfare between industrialized nations is ultimately decided not by battlefield heroics, but by the capacity to supply, sustain, and reinforce military forces faster than the enemy can destroy them. The D-Day invasion was the largest amphibious operation in military history, involving over 156,000 troops landing on 5 beaches along a 50-mile front in a single day. But the landing itself, dramatic as it was, represented only the beginning of the challenge. The real test would come in the days and weeks following, when the Allies would need to build up forces and supplies faster than the Germans could reinforce their defenses, when the battle would become a race between American logistics and German counterattack capability. The numbers involved were staggering, almost incomprehensible in their scale. In the first month after D-Day, from June 6 to July 6, 1944, American and Allied forces would land over 929,000 men, 177,000 vehicles, and 586,000 tons of supplies across the Normandy beaches. But this was merely the beginning. By the end of August 1944, just 11 weeks after the initial landing, the Allies had put ashore in France more than 2.2 million men, over 450,000 vehicles, and an astonishing 4 million tons of supplies. To put this in perspective, in a single month of the height of the buildup, July 1944, Allied forces landed over 2 million tons of material on French soil. 2 million tons. That represented more cargo than passed through the port of New York in many peacetime months, more supplies than many nations consumed a year, delivered across contested beaches onto a hostile shore, while fighting a determined enemy. The German High Command had anticipated the invasion, had spent years fortifying the Atlantic Wall, had positioned powerful armor reserves to counterattack any landing. What they could not have anticipated, because nothing in their experience prepared them for it, was the sheer scale and efficiency of American logistics. German military planning operated on assumptions derived from European warfare, that armies could be supplied through captured ports and rail networks, that logistics would always be the limiting factor in offensive operations, that an invading force separated from established supply lines would inevitably weaken and could be defeated through attrition. These assumptions were reasonable based on historical precedent. Every major military operation in European history had been constrained by logistics. Napoleon's Grande Armée had starved in Russia not because Russian soldiers defeated it, but because supply lines could not sustain it. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 had ground to a halt outside Moscow, partly because supplies could not keep pace with the advancing spearheads. Logistics had always favored the defender, who operated on interior lines with established infrastructure. But the Americans were about to demonstrate that with sufficient industrial capacity and systematic planning, logistics could become an offensive weapon more devastating than any number of tanks or artillery pieces. The planning for Operation Overlord, the code name for the Normandy invasion, included meticulous attention to logistics at a level that would have seemed excessive to traditional military minds. American staff officers calculated that each soldier in France would require approximately 70 pounds of supplies per day: food, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, replacement equipment. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of men, then by weeks and months of sustained operations, and the numbers become astronomical. The planners then worked backward from those requirements, calculating how many Liberty ships would be needed, how many landing craft, how many truck companies, how many supply depots, how many tons of material would need to be prepositioned in Britain before the invasion could even begin. The result was a logistical plan so comprehensive that it addressed everything from the number of typewriter ribbons needed for headquarters clerks to the gallons of insecticide required to control mosquitoes in tent camps. This was not mere bureaucratic obsessiveness. It reflected a fundamentally American approach to complex problems, the belief that any challenge could be solved through careful analysis, systematic. Major General Gunther von Kluge, who assumed command of German forces in France after the death of Field Marshal Rommel, wrote in a report to Hitler in late July 1944, "The enemy's superiority in material is so overwhelming that it cannot be compensated for by tactical skill or the bravery of our troops. We destroy 10 of their tanks, and 20 more appear the next day. We inflict casualties that would cripple any Wehrmacht division, and they attack again within hours with fresh troops. Most critically, they never run short of ammunition, fuel, or supplies. Our artillery must conserve shells while there's fires without apparent limit. This is not a battle we can win through military excellence. Their resources simply overwhelm any tactical advantages we create." This assessment, found in German military archives after the war, reveals how quickly senior German commanders recognized the futility of their position. Von Kluge was not a defeatist. He was a capable, experienced officer making a cold-eyed evaluation of the strategic situation, and his conclusion was devastating. Germany could not match American material abundance. What do you think the German soldiers felt when they realized that every tank they destroyed would be replaced, every position they held would be bombarded with unlimited ammunition, every defensive line they established would be outflanked by an enemy with inexhaustible resources? How does an army maintain its will to fight when the arithmetic of attrition so clearly favors the opponent? The landing of 2 million tons of supplies in a single month required solving unprecedented logistical challenges. The Allies had originally planned to capture the port of Cherbourg quickly and use it as the primary supply point for operations in France. But the Germans demolished the port facilities so thoroughly that Cherbourg would not become fully operational for months. This meant that the vast bulk of supplies had come directly across the invasion beaches, a task that conventional military wisdom held to be impossible on the scale required. The American solution was characteristically direct. If existing infrastructure was inadequate, they would build new infrastructure. The Mulberry Harbors, artificial ports constructed from concrete caissons, floating piers, and miles of connecting roadways, were towed across the English Channel and assembled off the Normandy coast, creating port facilities where none had existed before. These artificial harbors could handle 7,000 tons of supplies per day each, the equivalent of a medium-sized peacetime port, built from scratch in hostile waters under enemy fire. But even the mulberries were only part of the solution. The real key was the LST, the landing ship tank, an ungainly vessel specifically designed to beach itself, open massive bow doors, and disgorge vehicles and cargo directly onto shore. The United States produced over 1,000 LSTs during the war, each capable of carrying 20 tanks or 60 trucks or 2,100 tons of cargo. These ships could operate in areas where conventional cargo vessels could not go, could unload without cranes or dock facilities, could sustain the buildup even when ports were unavailable or destroyed. The efficiency of American unloading operations astonished even Allied observers. British port officers, accustomed to the traditional methods of cargo handling, where stevedores manually loaded and unloaded ships over days or weeks, watched in amazement as American units cleared an LST of vehicles and supplies in under 2 hours. The Americans used a system developed through extensive training exercises. Vehicles were preloaded in reverse order of priority, marked with clear destination codes, assigned to specific unloading areas on the beach, and dispatched inland immediately upon landing with drivers who had been briefed on routes and destinations. There was no confusion, no delay, no accumulation of material in vulnerable beach dumps. Supplies flowed from ship to shore to forward depots in a continuous stream, managed by officers trained specifically in logistics and traffic control, coordinated through communication networks that ensured every unit knew exactly where to go and what to collect. This was logistics as a science, refined through practice and supported by resources that allowed American planners to implement ideal solutions rather than making do with improvised expedients. Corporal Friedrich Hoffmann of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend fought against American forces throughout June and July of 1944, participating in the grinding battles around that were intended to prevent Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead. In his diary, recovered after his capture in August, Hoffmann recorded his growing despair. June 15th, we destroyed 3 American tanks today. Our Panther performed magnificently. June 22nd, more American tanks. Different types than before. The crews seem inexperienced, but there are so many of them. We cannot destroy them faster than they arrive. June 28th, our fuel ration has been cut again. The Americans fire artillery without cease. Do they have no ammunition shortages? July 7th, American aircraft attack anything that moves in daylight. We can only move at night, and even then risk being spotted. Meanwhile, their convoys drive openly in broad daylight. July 14th, our company is down to 4 operational tanks. We are told no replacements are available. Today we counted over 40 American tanks moving to the front. How can we fight this? July 20th, I no longer believe we can win. The Americans simply have too much of everything. This diary, with its progression from confidence through concern to despair, mirrors the experience of countless German soldiers who confronted American logistics and realized that courage and tactical skill were insufficient against such overwhelming material superiority. The supply requirements for an army in sustained combat are staggering. An American infantry division in active operations consumed approximately 650 tons of supplies per day: food, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, and countless other items necessary to keep the division functioning. An armored division consumed even more, as much as 800 tons per day, with fuel alone accounting for over 200,000 gallons. Multiply these figures by the dozens of divisions operating in France by August 1944, and the total daily requirement approached 40,000 tons. Meeting this requirement across invasion beaches, without major port facilities, while fighting a determined enemy, represented a logistical achievement without precedent in military history. And the Americans did not merely meet these requirements. They exceeded them, building up reserve stockpiles that ensured operations would never be halted due to supply shortages. By late August, Allied forces in France had accumulated over 200,000 tons of supplies in forward depots, enough to sustain operations for days even if the supply line from the beaches was completely severed. The symbol of American logistical power became the ubiquitous jerrycan. the 5-gallon fuel container that American forces used in quantities that seemed impossible to German observers. The jerrycan itself was actually a German invention, designed in the 1930s and copied by the Allies after they captured examples in North Africa. But while Germany produced jerrycans by the thousands, the United States produced them by the millions, over 21 million during the war. To German soldiers, accustomed to chronic fuel shortages that limited their mobility and forced them to conserve every liter of gasoline, the sight of American depots with tens of thousands of full jerrycans stacked in endless rows represented a disparity in national capacity that was almost surreal. American tanks that ran out of fuel on the battlefield would be refueled within hours. German tanks that exhausted their fuel often had to be abandoned because no resupply was available. American trucks ran continuously, moving supplies forward and casualties backward in an endless cycle. German units walked, conserving their limited vehicle fuel for emergencies. The jerrycan, painted olive drab marked with white stars, stenciled with supply codes, became the physical embodiment of American abundance, a 5-gallon reminder that the United States could produce, ship, and deliver more of everything than Germany could match. What do you think it means for an army's morale when soldiers see the enemy supplied with unlimited resources while their own supply lines fail? When every burned-out tank cannot be replaced, when every casualty leaves a gap that remains unfilled, when the ammunition ration must be conserved while the enemy fires without restriction, how long can discipline and training sustain combat effectiveness under those conditions? The American logistics system in France was built on a foundation laid months and years before the invasion. In Britain, the United States had accumulated the largest military stockpile ever assembled, over 5 million tons of supplies positioned in depots across southern England, ready to be loaded onto ships and transported to France. This buildup had taken years, involving thousands of Liberty ships making the dangerous Atlantic crossing despite German U-boat attacks, delivering cargo to British ports that were then sorted, stored, and organized for the invasion. The scale of this preparation was itself a form of warfare, a demonstration that the United States could project military power across an ocean, sustain it indefinitely, and do so while simultaneously fighting a second major campaign in the Pacific. Germany, fighting on interior lines in the heart of Europe with direct rail connections to all fronts, struggled to supply its forces adequately. The United States, operating across 3,000 miles of ocean, supplied its forces with such abundance that waste and inefficiency were tolerable because there was always more material available. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system that hauled supplies from Normandy beaches to forward units after the Allied breakout, became legendary for its scale and efficiency. At its peak in late August 1944, over 6,000 trucks operated continuously in a loop, carrying supplies forward and returning empty to collect more loads. The trucks ran day and night, following dedicated routes marked with red balls painted on signs, driven by soldiers who worked shifts so brutal that many fell asleep at the wheel. The system moved over 12,000 tons of supplies per day across distances up to 400 miles, a sustained logistical effort that would have been impossible without the vast numbers of trucks American industry had produced. The United States manufactured over 2.4 million trucks during World War II, with hundreds of thousands allocated to European operations. Germany, by contrast, produced fewer than 350,000 trucks during the entire war, and many of those were lost on the Eastern Front. The numerical disparity was so extreme that by 1944, German forces in France were using horse-drawn wagons for much of their logistics, while American units drove fleets of modern trucks. This was not a gap that could be closed through tactical innovation. It reflected fundamental differences in industrial capacity and resource availability. The Germans attempted to disrupt American logistics through air attacks and long-range artillery, but these efforts proved futile against the scale of the buildup. Luftwaffe air raids against the invasion beaches and supply dumps inflicted some damage, but could not sustain the intensity needed to significantly slow the buildup. German aircraft losses were prohibitive, and fuel shortages limited sortie rates to levels where the attacks became pinpricks rather than serious threats. Long-range artillery occasionally hit supply concentrations, destroying stockpiles and killing personnel, but the Americans simply absorbed the losses and continued operations. The system had been designed with redundancy and overcapacity built in. the assumption that some percentage of supplies would be lost to enemy action, accident, or waste, and that operations would continue regardless. This was a luxury Germany could not afford. When a German supply dump was destroyed by Allied air attack, the loss was irreplaceable and divisions went short of critical supplies. When an American supply dump was destroyed, replacement stocks were already en route from the beachhead or from Britain. Colonel Hans von Luck, a regimental commander in the 21st Panzer Division, described the psychological impact of American logistics in his post-war memoirs. "We could hear them at night. The sound of hundreds of trucks moving up the front, the rumble of tanks being transported on transporters, the noise of supplies being unloaded and distributed. We lay in our positions, knowing that we would face fresh troops and full ammunition loads in the morning, while we rationed our last shells and waited for reinforcements that never came. The Americans did not need to defeat us through superior tactics. They simply buried us under an avalanche of material that we had no counter for. I have commanded men in combat on 3 fronts, and I can say with certainty that morale, training, and tactical skill become meaningless when the disparity in resources reaches a certain threshold. We reached that threshold in Normandy in the summer of 1944. The food situation encapsulated the broader disparity. American soldiers in France received 3 full meals per day, with rations that included meat, vegetables, bread, desserts, coffee, and even cigarettes included as standard issue. The C-ration and K-ration packages that served as field rations when hot meals were unavailable contained more calories and variety than many European civilians saw in a week. American field kitchens served hot meals to frontline troops whenever tactical situations permitted, with fresh food trucked forward from supply depots where refrigerated warehouses stored perishables. German soldiers, by contrast, subsisted on increasingly meager rations as supply lines failed. Black bread, thin soup, and whatever could be scavenged locally became standard. Meat was rare, fresh vegetables rarer still. The official German ration in 1944 provided fewer calories than the American ration, and actual distributed rations often fell short of even those reduced levels as logistics collapsed. Captured German soldiers repeatedly expressed amazement at American food, not because it was particularly luxurious, but simply because it was adequate, reliable, and always available. The abundance of American rations became a propaganda tool, with leaflets dropped on German positions showing photographs of the meals American soldiers ate and promising similar treatment to those who surrendered. This was psychological warfare through logistics, demonstrating that America could afford to feed even its enemies better than Germany could feed its own soldiers. By late August 1944, the Allies had landed over 2.2 million men in France, but a logistics system had delivered far more than just personnel. Over 450,000 vehicles had been put ashore: trucks, jeeps, tanks, tank destroyers, artillery tractors, ambulances, command cars, motorcycles, bulldozers, cranes, and countless other specialized vehicles. This represented more motor transport than existed in the entire German military, delivered across contested beaches in 11 weeks. The vehicle density in Allied-controlled France became so high that traffic control became a significant challenge. Military police directed vehicles at intersections. One-way routes were established to prevent congestion, and maps showed recommended routes color-coded by vehicle type and priority. This was a problem German forces would have welcomed: the problem of having too many vehicles rather than too few. German units in France moved at the speed of walking infantry because they lacked the trucks to motorize. American units moved at the speed of their slowest vehicle because every soldier rode rather than walked. This disparity in mobility translated directly into operational tempo. Americans could concentrate forces, execute maneuvers, and exploit opportunities at speeds German commanders could not match. What do you think German generals thought when they received reports of American logistics capabilities? Did they believe the numbers, or did they dismiss them as exaggerated enemy propaganda? And when they finally accepted the reality, what options did they have other than retreat and delay? The infrastructure Americans built to support operations in France was itself a demonstration of industrial capacity. Fuel pipelines were constructed inland from the beaches, eventually creating the Pluto system, pipeline under the ocean, that pumped fuel directly from Britain to France beneath the English Channel. Railroads were repaired and reopened with American equipment and personnel. with locomotives and rolling stock shipped from the United States to replace what the Germans had destroyed or withdrawn. Airfields were constructed with astonishing speed. Combat engineers could clear, grade, and pave a fighter airship capable of handling 60 aircraft in under a week using bulldozers, graders, and prefabricated materials. Entire ports were built where none had existed, complete with cranes, warehouses, and repair facilities, turning small coastal villages into major logistics hubs in a matter of weeks. This was not merely supplying an army. It was industrializing a theater of operations, creating the infrastructure needed to sustain modern mechanized warfare, where previously only agricultural communities had existed. The Red Cross supplied American forces with amenities that German soldiers would have considered unimaginable luxuries: cigarettes, candy, magazines, playing cards, sports equipment, musical instruments, even phonographs and records. These items served no direct military purpose, but they sustained morale and demonstrated that America could afford to ship non-essential items across an ocean to keep its soldiers comfortable. Mobile shower units provided hot showers to frontline troops, rotating units out of combat for a day of rest, cleaning, and fresh uniforms. Laundry services cleaned and repaired uniforms. Dentists filled cavities and extracted infected teeth. Chaplains held services in multiple denominations. Entertainment units brought movies and live performances to rear areas. The United States military took care of its soldiers with thoroughness that reflected both humanitarian concern and the recognition that well-supplied, healthy, rested troops fight more effectively than exhausted, hungry, disease-ridden ones. German forces, by contrast, suffered from declining health, limited medical care, inadequate sanitation, and endemic fatigue as supply failures affected every aspect of military life. By late 1944, American soldiers captured in isolated skirmishes sometimes received better medical care as German prisoners than Wehrmacht soldiers received from their own medical services, simply because American field hospitals had supplies, anesthetics, antibiotics, and trained personnel, while German hospitals increasingly lacked all of these. The ammunition expenditure told its own story about the disparity in logistics. American artillery in France fired over 30 million rounds during the Normandy campaign alone, an average of over 300,000 rounds per day during intensive fighting. Some bombardments consumed more ammunition in a few hours than entire German divisions had available for weeks of operations. American infantry squads fired their weapons freely, knowing resupply was certain. German infantry hoarded ammunition, firing only when targets were certain, knowing that once their basic load was expended, they might wait days for resupply. This disparity affected tactics. Americans could use suppressive fire liberally, could pin down enemy positions with volume of fire while maneuvering, could call down artillery barges that pulverized offensive positions. Germans had to make every shot count, could not afford suppressive fire, had to conserve artillery ammunition for critical moments. The tactical advantages created by unlimited ammunition were enormous, but more important was the psychological impact. American soldiers knew their logistics would support them, while German soldiers increasingly knew theirs would not. Lieutenant Werner Kortenhaus, a company commander in the 2nd Panzer Division, was captured during the Falaise pocket battles in August 1944. In interrogation, he described the collapse of German logistics. By early August, we had no fuel for our vehicles, minimal ammunition for our weapons, and were eating captured American rations because our own supply system had ceased to function. The roads were choked with destroyed German vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel. American aircraft attacked anything that moved, making daytime movement suicidal. We could see American supply trucks operating openly a few kilometers away, while we couldn't move a single vehicle without risking destruction. The contrast was total. They had everything. We had nothing. When my men learned they would receive hot food, medical care, and cigarettes as prisoners, many of them were relieved to be captured. This is what it came to: German soldiers preferring captivity to serving a military that could no longer supply them. The turning point in the Normandy campaign came not from a brilliant tactical maneuver, but from the grinding reality of logistics. The Germans could not replace their losses while Americans replaced theirs and continued building up strength. By late July, the correlation of forces had shifted so decisively that the Mortain counteroffensive, Germany's last major attempt to split the Allied beachhead, failed not because of tactical errors, but because the attacking divisions lacked the fuel, ammunition, and replacements needed to sustain offensive operations. The attack stalled within days, and the Allied breakout that followed encircled and destroyed significant portions of Army Group west in the Falaise Pocket. Over 50,000 German soldiers were captured, hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles were destroyed or abandoned, and the Wehrmacht's capacity to conduct organized offensive operations in France collapsed. The pursuit across France that followed in late August and early September saw American armored columns advancing at speeds that far exceeded their plan rates, limited only by fuel supply as their trucks struggled to keep pace. The famous halt at the German border in September, which allowed German forces to stabilize and created the conditions for prolonged fighting of autumn and winter 1944, occurred not because German defenders had stopped the Americans, but because American supply lines had finally stretched beyond sustainable limits. Even then, the pause lasted only weeks before the logistics system caught up and operations resumed. The Liberty ship became the unsung symbol of American logistics dominance. The ugly, welded, mass-produced cargo vessel that carried material of war across the Atlantic in sufficient quantities to overwhelm the German U-boat campaign and supply the largest amphibious invasion in history. American shipyards produced over 2,700 Liberty ships during the war, building them so quickly that the record time from keel laying to launch was under 5 days. These ships were not technological marvels. They were deliberately simple, designed for rapid mass production and ease of operation rather than elegance or efficiency. But they worked, and there were so many of them that losing dozens to U-boats barely affected the flow of supplies to Europe. Germany sank over 200 Liberty ships during the war, but this represented less than 8% production and was completely inadequate to prevent the buildup of forces in Britain or the subsequent supply of operations in France. The U-boat campaign, which had come close to severing Britain's Atlantic lifeline in 1942-43, was defeated not primarily by Allied anti-submarine warfare improvements, but by American shipbuilding capacity that produced cargo vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. This was industrial warfare in its purest form. Victory through production rates, success through the ability to sustain losses, and continue operating while the enemy's capability to inflict those losses degraded over time. What do you think the German high command thought when they calculated American production figures? Did they believe their own intelligence, or did they assume the numbers must be exaggerated, inflated by enemy propaganda? And when the reality of American material superiority became undeniable on the battlefields of France, what psychological impact did that have on leaders who had begun the war confident of German military supremacy? The maintenance system Americans established in France demonstrated the same overwhelming approach to logistics as their supply system. American units included organic maintenance capability, mechanics, spare parts, specialized tools, and recovery vehicles organic to each battalion and regiment. Damaged vehicles were recovered from battlefields, repaired in mobile workshops, and returned to service within days. More seriously damaged equipment was evacuated to rear area depots where comprehensive facilities could rebuild entire vehicles from salvage parts. The Americans could afford to declare vehicles total losses and abandon them if recovery was impractical. There were always more coming from the beaches or from the United States. German forces, by contrast, went extraordinary lengths to recover every damaged tank, every disabled vehicle, because replacements were not available. Panzers that would have been written off as total losses by American standards were cannibalized for parts to keep other tanks operational. The Germans fought not merely with the tanks they had landed in France, but with the same individual tanks, repaired repeatedly, patched together with improvised parts, kept running through mechanical ingenuity and desperation. By August, many German armored units contained more repaired tanks than fresh vehicles, machines held together by the skill of mechanics working without adequate parts, fuel, or time. This was an army consuming itself, unable to replace losses, watching its combat power erode with each engagement, while the Americans grew stronger with each passing day. The medical system mirrored the broader logistics disparity. American casualties were evacuated from front lines within hours, treated at field hospitals with full surgical capabilities, and evacuated to Britain if serious care was needed, all supported by ambulances, supplies, antibiotics, blood plasma, and trained surgeons in abundance. Survival rates for wounded American soldiers in Europe exceeded 97%. If a soldier reached medical care alive, his chances of survival were overwhelming. German casualties, by contrast, often waited hours or days for evacuation due to vehicle shortages, were treated in hospitals that lacked supplies and medicines, and died from wounds that would have been survivable with adequate care. The contrast affected morale profoundly. American soldiers knew that if wounded, they would receive the best care available. German soldiers increasingly faced the prospect of dying from survivable wounds due to system failures beyond their control. By September 1944, 3 months after D-Day, the Allies had established in France a logistics infrastructure that exceeded the capacity of most major ports in peacetime. Over 3 million tons of supplies had been landed, organized, and distributed to support operations that had liberated most of France and reached the German border. The scale of this achievement becomes clear when compared to German logistics in the same theater. At the peak of Wehrmacht defensive operations in June and July, total German supplies delivered to forces in France totaled fewer than 15,000 tons per day across all supply categories. And this rate decreased steadily as Allied air attacks destroyed transportation networks and consumed the limited reserves Germany had accumulated. The Americans, operating across invasion beaches without major ports, were delivering more supplies in a week than Germany delivered in a month. This was not a tactical disadvantage that could be overcome through clever maneuvering or defensive skill. It was a systemic collapse caused by the complete failure of German logistics to compete with American capacity. The jerrycan remained the enduring symbol, millions of them stacked at supply points, carried on every vehicle, visible evidence of American abundance. When American units advanced, they left behind depots full of supplies for follow-on forces. When German units retreated, they destroyed their limited stocks to prevent capture and then went without. In the final months of the war in Europe, from the autumn 1944 through to May 1945, German forces were supplied primarily through captured stocks and battlefield salvage, supplemented by the dwindling output of German industry. American forces were supplied by a system so robust that waste was routine, that allowed for every soldier to have new boots when his wore out, fresh uniforms when his were damaged, hot meals when operations permitted, and ammunition sufficient that officers never needed to order conservation. The disparity had become so extreme that it affected how battles were fought. Americans could afford to use material-intensive tactics, bombarding positions with artillery before assaulting them, calling in air strikes liberally, withdrawing when faced with strong resistance, and bypassing obstacles rather than taking casualties to overcome them. Germans had to fight with what they carried, hold positions because no supplies existed to establish new ones, and accept casualties because firepower solutions were unavailable. In the forests of the Ardennes in December 1944, during Germany's last major offensive in the West, the material disparity defined the battle's outcome as decisively as any tactical decision. The German attack achieved initial surprise and made significant penetrations, but the offensive stalled within days when attacking units ran out of fuel and ammunition. German planning had assumed they would capture American supply dumps and use captured fuel to sustain the advance. They were planning an offensive based on stealing enemy supplies because their own logistics could not support sustained operations. When American resistance prevented the capture of key supply points, German spearheads literally ran empty and stopped in place, their tanks abandoned for lack of fuel just miles from their objectives. The Americans, after initial confusion, brought overwhelming force to bear, rushed reinforcements to the threatened sector, and systematically destroyed the German penetrations through the application of superior firepower and mobility enabled by unlimited logistics. The Battle of the Bulge was decided not in small unit combat, but in the unequal contest between American supply superiority and German logistical desperation. What does it mean for a nation's military power when its offensives must plan to capture enemy supplies because its own logistics cannot sustain operations? What does it reveal about the relative strength of two powers when one fights with abundance while the other fights with scarcity? The liberation of Paris in August 1944 provided a moment of perfect contrast. American forces entering the city found French civilians near starvation after years of German occupation and requisitioning. The Americans immediately established supply distribution, drawing on their abundant stocks to feed the population, demonstrating that they could not only sustain their own forces, but also assume responsibility for civilian populations in liberated territories. German forces, retreating across France, lived off the land when possible and went hungry when it was not, their own supply system having collapsed to the point where German soldiers envied the rations of the French civilians they had occupied. The reversal was complete. The conquering power of 1940 reduced to a logistics-starved force in retreat, while the power they had expected to defeat had arrived with such overwhelming material superiority that it could feed an entire city while simultaneously supporting the largest military campaign in the Western theater. The numbers that defined the summer of 1944 remain staggering. 2 million tons of supplies landed in a single month. To visualize this, imagine a freight train stretching from Normandy to Berlin, loaded with every conceivable military necessity. Then imagine that train arriving every single day for 30 days. That was the scale of American logistics, the physical manifestation of industrial capacity so vast that it defied German comprehension. The Wehrmacht had fought the Soviets to a standstill through tactical skill despite material disadvantages. They had defended Italy with brilliant use of terrain despite being outnumbered. But in France, facing American logistics operating at full capacity, tactical skill became irrelevant. The Germans were not defeated in decisive battles. They were systematically ground down by an enemy that could replace every loss, repair every damaged vehicle, supply every unit, and sustain offensive operations indefinitely because the flow of material from across the Atlantic never ceased. The final irony was that German war production actually increased through 1944, that German factories produced more tanks, more aircraft, more guns than they had in earlier years. But production meant nothing without the logistics to deliver that production to frontline units, to supply those units with fuel and ammunition once equipped, to sustain them in combat and replace their losses. German production increases disappeared into the void of collapsed logistics, equipment destroyed by Allied air attacks before reaching the front, tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, ammunition stockpiled at factories that could not transport it to the troops who needed it. The Americans did not need to destroy German industry. They had already destroyed German logistics, and without logistics, production was meaningless. In May 1945, when German forces surrendered unconditionally, American supply dumps in Europe contained over 8 million tons of material. More supplies stockpiled in theater than had been landed in the entire first 4 months after D-Day. The war had ended not because Germany ran out of soldiers or weapons, but because the system supporting those soldiers and weapons had collapsed under the weight of Allied material superiority. German generals, interrogated after the war, repeatedly cited logistics as a decisive factor in their defeat. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of German forces in the West, stated bluntly, "The Americans won through superior logistics, not superior generalship. We could counter their tactics, but we had no answer to their material abundance." The jerrycan, that humble 5-gallon container painted olive drab, remained scattered across Europe after the war, repurposed for civilian use, a mundane artifact of the conflict that had shaped the continent's fate. But for those who understood its significance, each jerrycan represented something profound: the triumph of industrial capacity over martial valor, the victory of systematic organization over tactical brilliance, the demonstration that in modern warfare between industrialized nations, abundance is itself a weapon more devastating than courage or skill can overcome. The Germans had expected to fight a war of movement and decision, where superior training and doctrine would yield victory despite material disadvantages. Instead, they fought a war of attrition against an enemy that could afford to trade material for lives, that never ran short because the source, American industrial capacity, was beyond the reach of German military power and vastly exceeded anything Germany could match. The story of those 2 million tons landed in a single month is not merely a logistical curiosity or a footnote in military history. It is a story of how World War II was truly won, not through battlefield heroics or strategic genius, though both played roles, but through the unglamorous, systematic, overwhelming application of industrial capacity to the problems of modern warfare. The victory was won in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, in the shipyards of the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, in the training camps where logistics officers learned their craft, and in the staff offices where planners calculated tonnage and schedules and 1,000 details that would ensure American soldiers never fought without adequate support. It was won through jerrycans and Liberty ships, through trucks and depots, through the recognition that in mechanized warfare, the side with superior logistics doesn't need to outfight its opponent. It can simply outlast them, grinding them down through the inexorable pressure of superior supply until resistance becomes futile. What do we learn from the story about the nature of power, about the relationship between industrial capacity and military capability, about the ways that abundance itself can become a form of warfare? Perhaps we learn that freedom and democracy, systems that unleash productive capacity and organizational efficiency, carry within them a form of strength that authoritarian systems cannot match, not because democracies produce better soldiers, but because they produce more of everything, because they can afford to supply their soldiers so thoroughly that tactical disadvantages become irrelevant, because they can sustain operations indefinitely while their opponents exhaust themselves. The 2 million tons landed in July 1944 represented more than supplies. They represented a way of war, an approach to conflict that valued systematic preparation over heroic improvisation, that relied on overwhelming material superiority rather than accepting fair fights, that won through the patient accumulation of advantages rather than through desperate gambles. And in the end, that approach proved decisive, as it would prove decisive in every subsequent conflict where industrial powers clashed and one side possessed capacity to supply its forces without limit while the other did not. The jerrycans remain scattered reminders of a truth that shaped the modern world. In industrial warfare, logistics is destiny, abundance is power, and the nation that could deliver 2 million tons in a single month can overcome any opponent, no matter how brave or skilled, because courage cannot compete with unlimited supply, and skill cannot compensate for systemic material superiority.